The crack echoes. Skin on skin, sharp enough to silence a room full of predators. Nadine's head snaps to the side, and for one frozen second, the warehouse backroom in Philadelphia holds its breath. Junho's hand is still raised, fingers spread like he's waiting for applause. His inner circle, 6 men who've seen worse done worse, lean forward with the sick curiosity of people who love watching power assert itself. But Nadine doesn't fold. She turns her head back slowly, impossibly calm, and touches her cheek once. Not tenderly, not dramatically, like she's checking a fact. Her dark eyes meet Junho's, and something in her gaze makes the room's temperature drop. The worst mistakes men make aren't always the violent ones. Sometimes it's the moment they assume you're too weak to respond. Junho's breathing quickens, just slightly, fear dressed up as authority. He wants her to cry, to beg, to perform the humiliation he needs his men to see. Because that's what this gathering was always about. Proving he still controls something when everything else is slipping through his fingers. Nadine doesn't give him that. Instead, she looks at him the way you look at a man who just made an irreversible choice. Not with hatred. Not with fear. With measurement. Like she's calculating the exact distance between husband and problem. The men shift in their seats, uncomfortable now, because the script they expected isn't playing out. One of them clears his throat. Another glances toward the door like he suddenly wishes he wasn't in this room. What happened in the next 5 minutes didn't just end a marriage. It ended a myth that kept dangerous men comfortable for too long. But we're not there yet. Right now, in this suspended moment, Nadine is still the woman they think they know, the quiet Jamaican wife, the soft-spoken one who never interrupts, never challenges, never makes Junho look small in front of his crew. Black, beautiful in a way that made her invisible, because men like these only see threats, trophies, or tools. Nadine learned long ago how to be none of those things. I spent years being the woman they expected, quiet, soft, Jamaican wife who smiled at the right times and never interrupted. She perfected it, actually. The lowered eyes at dinner. The agreeable tone when Junho made decisions that affected her life without asking. The performance of fragility that kept his ego fed and her intentions buried. But every disguise has an expiration date, and Junho just ripped hers off with one public, theatrical slap. The thing is, Nadine chose restraint, for years. Not because she had to, but because violence always creates a new chain, and she swore she'd never be that woman again. The one who solved problems with what her hands could do. The one whose past in Jamaica taught her things that can't be untaught. But choice only works when the other person respects it. Junho never did. He mistook her silence for weakness, her patience for fear, her careful, controlled calm for proof that he owned her. Now, standing in a warehouse backroom with 6 witnesses and one husband who's already lost but doesn't know it yet, Nadine feels something ancient wake up behind her ribs. Not rage, clarity. She doesn't speak. Not yet. Because when she does, the room will learn what happens when you confuse mercy with helplessness. When you slap a master and call it dominance. To understand why that slap destroyed him, you need to know how I became invisible in the first place. Rewind 72 hours. 72 hours earlier, Nadine's life looked like peace. At least that's what Junho called it. Dinner at 6:30, no phones at the table, shoes lined by the door. The kind of routines that look like stability from the outside, but feel like choreography when you're the one performing them. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, gave Nadine something she hadn't had in years. Anonymity. A city big enough to disappear into, quiet enough to breathe without constantly checking reflections in storefront windows. She kept her head down, her voice soft, her presence forgettable. But forgettable didn't mean blind. Nadine watched everything. When Junho's men entered their home for business meetings, she tracked who touched their right hip when they sat, who kept their jacket unbuttoned, who scanned exits before settling into a chair. Small signals that separated loud fools from real threats. She folded laundry in the next room and listened to tones shift. Confidence, nervousness, the particular pitch fear takes when it's dressed up as loyalty. She learned their patterns faster than they learned hers. Which captain drank too much? Which one had a gambling problem? Which one looked at her a half-second too long when Junho wasn't watching? Information, Nadine understood, was the only currency that mattered when you had no other power. Junho liked to tell the story of how they met. He'd tell it differently depending on his mood. sometimes a romance, sometimes a rescue, always with him as the hero who gave her a better life. The subtext was clear. She owed him gratitude, obedience, the performance of softness that made him feel large. Have you ever lived with someone who confused love with control? Where protection felt more like a leash? Nadine had, every day, for years. She didn't argue because arguments were emotional noise, and in Junho's world, noise got punished. Not always with violence, sometimes with coldness, withdrawal, the strategic withholding of affection that made you doubt whether you deserved warmth in the first place. So Nadine smiled at the right times, stayed quiet, let him believe the story he needed to believe, that his Jamaican wife was gentle because she had to be, not because she chose to be. Then the driver came back. It was a Tuesday. Nadine was in the kitchen when she heard Junho's voice spike, that particular register that meant something had gone wrong in a way he couldn't immediately fix. She moved to the doorway, tea towel still in her hands, and watched him read a torn piece of paper twice. His hand shook, just slightly, but Nadine saw it. The protected run, one of Junho's guaranteed routes along the I-95 corridor that moved product without interference, had disappeared. The driver returned alive, which was somehow worse than if he'd vanished completely, because alive meant a message. You don't own what you think you own. 8 words, enough to crack open something in Junho that Nadine had never seen before. Pure humiliation. Not anger, not strategy, just the raw fear of a man realizing his power might be borrowed. That night, everything changed texture. Locks clicked into place, extra ones, new ones, the sound sharp and final like bones snapping. Guards appeared in corners of their home that used to feel private, cameras installed in hallways. Junho's voice on the phone cycled through fear disguised as authority, barking orders that sounded more like questions. His men stopped laughing when he entered rooms. That shift, from easy confidence to wary silence, told Nadine more than any briefing could. The crew smelled weakness the way predators smell blood. And Junho knew it. Nadine folded the same shirt 3 times, hands moving on autopilot, while her mind tracked every variable. The message wasn't random. Someone knew exactly which route, which night, which driver. Someone knew where Junho kept his confidence. And the way Junho's hand shook when he read it, that told me someone knew exactly where to press. She didn't ask questions. Wives weren't supposed to. But she listened. And what she heard underneath Junho's commands was something she'd been trained to recognize long before Pennsylvania. The sound of a man realizing he's not in control and deciding someone close to him needs to pay the price for that realization. If you've ever felt trapped by someone who claimed to protect you, you'll understand what came next. Please like the video and subscribe. I put a lot of effort into this video. And it hurts when people watch and don't subscribe. It means a lot to me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. 2 days passed. Security tightened. Junho's paranoia thickened the air in their home until it felt hard to breathe. Then he walked in. Elias Mercer. Too polished for the streets. Too calm for a man entering a room full of criminals. Expensive coat, measured smile, the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need to prove itself because it already won. And the way he looked at Nadine, not through her, not past her, but at her, like she wasn't furniture, like she was the real target. That's when Nadine knew. Whatever was coming wasn't about Junho's empire. It was about her. Elias Mercer didn't knock. He simply appeared in the doorway of Junho's private office, like he'd been invited, though no invitation had been extended. Nadine stood in the adjacent room, close enough to hear, but positioned like she wasn't listening. A skill she'd perfected over years of being dismissed as decoration. She watched through the gap in the door, hands still folded around the tea towel she'd been holding when he arrived. Elias wore an expensive coat, not flashy, just quietly costly in the way that signals real money, not criminal theater. His voice was soft, measured, the kind of calm that didn't need volume because it already held all the leverage. 72 hours, Elias said, settling into the chair across from Junho without waiting for permission. There's a location. I'll send the details. A show of respect. That's all this needs to be. Junho leaned back, trying to fill space the way he always did when someone threatened his authority. You walk into my home. Not a home, Elias interrupted gently. A facility. Let's not confuse the two. The correction landed like a slap. Nadine saw Junho's jaw tighten, watched him swallow the rage that wanted to explode but couldn't, because Elias wasn't offering a fight. He was offering paperwork. "You've built something impressive," Elias continued, voice still pleasant, still polite. "Legitimate fronts, clean channels, just enough distance from the dirty work to keep the authorities comfortable. But that distance? It's built on relationships, permits, goodwill, and those things can evaporate very quickly when the right people start asking the right questions." He wasn't threatening violence. He was threatening something worse, systemic collapse. Frozen accounts, inspections that would shut down every front business Junho owned, anonymous tips delivered to investigators who'd been waiting for an excuse, the kind of pressure that turns empires into evidence. Junho tried to recover. "I have people. You have access," Elias corrected again. "And access ends when the people providing it decide you're more trouble than profit." Then Elias did something that made Nadine's pulse spike. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence through the gap in the door, and spoke directly to the space she occupied. "Mrs. Kwan," he said not loudly but clearly, "you don't need to hide. This concerns you too." Nadine's breath caught. Men like Junho spent years pretending wives were invisible during business. Elias shattered that illusion in one sentence. She stepped into the doorway, tea towel still in hand, face carefully neutral. Elias smiled, not predatory, not warm, just knowing, like he'd been waiting for her to show herself. "Nadine," he said, and the way he spoke her name, soft, practiced, familiar, made her stomach turn cold. Not because she was weak, because she recognized what it meant when a stranger knew exactly how to pronounce your name, where to place the emphasis, how to make it sound like he'd said it before. Some would say Elias was just business. But the way he said my name, Nadine, like he'd been practicing it, that wasn't business. That was personal. Junho's eyes flicked between them, confusion and suspicion warring on his face. "She has nothing to do with this, doesn't she?" Elias tilted his head slightly, still watching Nadine with that unsettling calm. "Family creates responsibility. Connections create vulnerability. And Mrs. Kwan is very connected, even if she prefers not to advertise it." Nadine's stomach dropped. My stomach went cold. Not because I'm weak, because I know what men like Elias do with information. They don't use it to threaten. They use it to own. Elias stood, smoothing his coat like the conversation was already over. 72 hours, Mr. Kwan. The location will be sent within the hour. Bring your inner circle. Show respect. And perhaps we can all walk away from this with our structures intact. He moved toward the door, paused beside Nadine, and lowered his voice to something only she could hear. "It's been a long time since Jamaica, hasn't it?" Then he was gone. The door clicked shut. Too soft, too polite. And the silence that followed felt heavier than any shout. Junho turned on Nadine immediately. What did he mean? Jamaica? What is he talking about? Nadine didn't answer. Because the truth was a trapdoor she'd spent years keeping sealed, and Elias had just handed Junho the key without telling him what opening it would cost. Why does a fixer from Philadelphia know enough about a Jamaican woman to use her as leverage? What did I leave behind that followed me here? 72 hours. That's all Junho had to prove himself. But those 72 hours, they proved who he really was. The testing started small. A hand on Nadine's elbow as they moved through the house. Nothing violent, just pressure that lasted 3 seconds too long. A request phrased as a question that wasn't actually a question. "You'll stay home today, won't you?" The way Junho corrected her posture in front of his men, gentle but public, like she was a child who needed reminding how to stand. He called it protection. Nadine felt the cage closing. Within 24 hours of Elias's visit, their home transformed. Not louder, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes from surveillance, from men stationed in places that used to feel private. Junho's captains lingered longer after meetings, their eyes tracking Nadine's movements like she'd become a variable in an equation they hadn't accounted for. She heard the words they thought she couldn't hear. Liability. Whispered in the hallway outside the kitchen. Leverage. Muttered near the back door when they assumed she was upstairs. One of them, she couldn't see who, used a word that made her hand stop mid-fold on the laundry. Hostage. Not wife. Not partner. Object. Nadine kept folding. Muscle memory took over. Smooth the fabric, align the seams, stack with precision, while her mind worked a different problem. Which drawer in the bedroom held the spare cash Junho thought she didn't know about? Which window in the guest bathroom had a lock that didn't quite catch? Which neighbor's roof could be reached if she needed to move fast and quiet? What would you do if the person who promised safety became the biggest threat? Comment below. Stay or plan your exit. Nadine was planning. She copied keys while Junho showered. Small duplicates that fit in her palm, easy to hide inside the lining of her coat. She packed a bag and buried it behind winter clothes in the closet neither of them touched. Cash, a burner phone still in its package, one change of clothes that wouldn't stand out on a bus or a train. She made a mental list of safe contacts, though safe was relative when your husband controlled half the city's underground. Every preparation was invisible. Every move calculated to look like nothing. Because Nadine understood that survival wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small, boring work of building exits before you needed them. Junho tried to fight back the only way he knew how, with money and pressure. He made calls. Quiet, clipped conversations where he tried to cut Elias off financially, reroute shipments, move assets through alternate channels. Nadine listened from the next room and heard confidence in his voice, the tone of a man who believed his reach was longer than anyone else's. The response came within hours. Accounts froze. Not all of them, just enough to send a message. Shipments stalled at checkpoints that had never been a problem before. A routine inspection shut down one of their cleanest fronts. A legitimate business that had operated without trouble for 3 years suddenly flagged for code violations that materialized overnight. Nadine watched Junho's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and something she'd never seen in him before. Fear that couldn't be masked. His voice on the phone shifted. Still commanding, still authoritative, but underneath it, now there was a pitch that didn't quite land. Desperation dressed up as control. When Junho's voice went soft, that's when Nadine knew he was most dangerous. Not loud, not dramatic, just cold. He found her in the kitchen that evening, standing at the counter, knife in hand, slicing vegetables with the kind of methodical precision she used to calm her thoughts. "You spoke to him," Junho said. Not a question, an accusation. Nadine didn't look up. "I didn't." "He knew your name. He knew Jamaica. You told him something?" "I didn't." The silence stretched. Nadine felt him watching her hands, the knife, the steady rhythm of blade against cutting board. She kept her movements even, controlled, because stillness was the only defense she had left. "You don't leave this house," Junho said finally. Soft, cold, final. "Not until this is finished." Nadine set the knife down carefully, turned to face him, and said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't escalate into something neither of them could walk back from. That night, she heard them talking. Junho's inner circle, gathered in the office downstairs, voices low, but not low enough. Nadine stood at the top of the stairs, barefoot, breath held, listening. "She's a problem," one of the captains said. She recognized his voice, the one who always sat closest to the door. "Elias knows her. That makes her leverage." Another voice, younger, less certain. "So what do we do?" "Move her somewhere safe, just until this Elias thing is resolved." Nadine waited for Junho to shut it down, waited for him to defend her, to say she was his wife, to draw a line that couldn't be crossed. He hesitated. Just a beat. 2 seconds of silence where he should have spoken. 2 seconds where he weighed his options like she was cargo, not a person. That hesitation told me everything. I wasn't his wife anymore. I was a problem he hadn't decided how to solve. Nadine backed away from the stairs, moved to the bedroom, closed the door without making a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, and felt something ancient and disciplined wake up in her chest. Not rage, not panic, clarity. I had 48 hours left, and I realized something that changed everything. Junho didn't just underestimate me. He had no idea who I used to be. The documents were hidden in plain sight. Nadine found them in Junho's office while he was out managing the fallout from Elias's pressure. A leather folder tucked between tax records and business receipts, the kind of paperwork that looked boring enough to ignore. She wasn't snooping. She was searching for ammunition. What she found was a loaded gun with her fingerprints already on it. Property deeds, business registrations, bank account authorizations, all dated over the past 3 years, all signed in her careful handwriting, all carrying the same legal owner, Nadine Sinclair Kwan. She remembered signing them. Junho had presented each document with the same explanation: for protection. If anything happens to me, you'll be taken care of. He'd lean over her shoulder, cologne sharp and expensive, sandalwood and something darker, something that always smelled like control, and guide her hand to the signature line. Just here, love. It's safer this way. He thought she signed without reading. Nadine had read every word, every clause, every contingency. Because back in Jamaica, before Philadelphia, before Junho, before the performance of softness became her armor, she'd learned that survival meant understanding exactly what you were agreeing to, even when saying no wasn't an option. The paper felt different now in her hands. Not just legal weight, proof. Proof that she owned the legitimate fronts that kept Junho's empire from looking like a criminal enterprise. The properties that laundered dirty money into clean rent. The accounts that made him look successful instead of dangerous. She owned the foundation, which meant she could collapse it. Nadine's hands didn't shake as she photographed each page with the burner phone she'd activated that morning. Muscle memory took over, the same steady calm she'd used years ago when discipline wasn't a choice, but a requirement. When her instructors in Jamaica taught her that power wasn't about size or strength, it was about knowing exactly where to apply pressure and when. Back home, they taught me 3 things: discipline, patience, and how to end a fight before the other person knows it started. I promised myself I'd never use that again, but promises break when cages get too small. The training had been brutal. Hours of repetition until movements became reflex. Mental conditioning that taught her how to stay calm when violence erupted around her, how to read a room faster than the men who thought volume equaled dominance, how to wait for the exact right moment to act. Because acting too early got you killed, and acting too late got you forgotten. She'd buried that version of herself when she left. Told herself she'd never need to be that woman again, that Junho's world was different, that she could survive on invisibility alone. She'd been wrong. Nadine slid the documents back into the folder, positioned exactly as she'd found them, and straightened the desk. No evidence she'd been there. No sign she knew what she now held. The betrayal settled into her chest. Not hot, not sharp, just cold and factual. Junho had never trusted her with truth. He trusted her with signatures, with legal liability dressed up as protection. He'd made her useful without making her informed, given her ownership without agency, built his safety net using her name as the rope. The marriage wasn't intimacy. It was infrastructure. She thought about the early days. The way Junho had looked at her like she mattered. The promises he'd made about safety, stability, a life where she wouldn't have to keep looking over her shoulder. She'd believed him because she'd needed to believe someone. Because running alone gets exhausting, and having a powerful man's protection felt like rest. But protection only works when the person offering it respects you. Junho didn't respect her. He managed her. The cologne smell lingered in the office, sandalwood and control, and Nadine remembered every time he'd leaned over her shoulder with documents, voice warm, hand steady on her back. Just sign here, love. Never explaining, never asking if she understood, just assuming her compliance because he'd built a world where her compliance was the only option. Except now she understood the quiet irony that would destroy him. In trying to protect himself, Junho had handed her the cleanest, most legal way to end him. No violence, no mess, just paperwork. The empire he'd built on fear and loyalty could be dismantled with signatures and withdrawals, and the kind of systemic collapse he couldn't fight his way out of. Tell me in the comments, if you discovered you held all the power in a relationship that treated you like property, would you use it or walk away quietly? Nadine closed the office door behind her, moved through the house like nothing had changed, and started preparing for a war Junho didn't know was already lost. She wasn't running. Not yet. Because running implied fear, and what she felt now wasn't fear. It was the cold, patient certainty of someone who'd finally found the leverage she needed. 36 hours left, and Junho was about to see something I'd kept buried for years. But not because I wanted to show him, because he forced my hand. Nadine decided to test the boundaries. Not dramatically, not with confrontation, just a small shift in routine. The kind of normal behavior that shouldn't register as rebellion unless the person watching you had already decided you were a threat. I'm meeting a friend for coffee this afternoon, she said over breakfast, voice casual, eyes on her plate. Junho's fork stopped mid-air. The pause lasted 2 seconds too long. Which friend? Lisa, from the community center. A lie, but a plausible one. Nadine had learned that the best lies were boring, details that invited no follow-up questions. Cancel it. Not a request, a command. Nadine looked up slowly, met his eyes, and saw something she'd been expecting but hoping wouldn't come this fast. Paranoia that had metastasized into control so complete it couldn't even pretend to be love anymore. She asked, calm, measured, giving him one chance to choose reason. Because I said so. The cage snapped shut. Within an hour, an escort was assigned. One of Junho's men, the quiet one who never smiled, who kept his right hand always visible, always ready, positioned himself near the front door like furniture that breathed. For your safety, Junho said, not looking at her. Her phone disappeared from the kitchen counter where she'd left it. When she asked, Junho handed it back with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just making sure everything's secure. You understand. She understood. He'd cloned it, installed something, turned her device into a leash. The questions started that evening. Not loud, not violent, just relentless. Where did you go today? Nowhere. I was home. Who did you call? No one. What did Elias mean about Jamaica? I don't know. Each answer carved a deeper groove into Junho's suspicion. Each denial made him more certain she was hiding something, which she was, but not the thing he feared. He thought she was conspiring. She was surviving. We've all seen relationships where love became ownership. But this was something colder. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens when control meets consequence. The men watched her differently now. When she moved through the house, their eyes tracked her, not with the dismissive glances they'd used before, but with the focused attention predators give prey they're not sure is actually prey. Some looked curious, like they were trying to solve a puzzle. Others looked hungry, like they'd already decided what her weakness was and were just waiting for permission to exploit it. One of the younger captains cornered her in the hallway, too close, breath smelling like cigarettes and cheap confidence. You're causing problems, he said quietly. Not threatening. Informing. Like he was doing her a favor by letting her know. Nadine didn't step back, didn't flinch, just looked at him with the kind of blank calm that made people uncomfortable when they expected fear. Move, she said. One word. Flat. He moved. But the message was clear. Junho's men were circling, testing boundaries, waiting to see if she'd become fair game. That night, Nadine stood at the upstairs window and watched traffic flow along I-95, the interstate corridor that cut through Philadelphia along the Delaware River, carrying people toward exits she couldn't take. Cars moved with the kind of freedom she used to take for granted. No one asking where they were going, no one monitoring their phones, no one assigning escorts. Escape route and trap route in one, because running meant leaving the documents behind, leaving the leverage, leaving the only weapon she had. Her reflection in the glass looked tired, not broken, just tired of performing. The phone in her pocket buzzed, Junho's phone, the one he insisted she carry now. A message. Not from him, from an unknown number. Warehouse. South End near the river. Tomorrow, 8 p.m. Bring your circle. This is the last invitation. Elias. The gathering location. Final terms. The public stage where Junho would try to prove he still mattered, still controlled something, still owned the room. Nadine read it twice, then watched Junho's reaction when he got the same message downstairs. She heard him bark orders, heard phones ringing, heard the machinery of his pride grinding into motion. He was going to that warehouse believing he could intimidate his way through this. He still didn't understand what Elias really wanted. And worse, he still didn't understand what Nadine was. She deleted the message and stared back out at I-95. Escort, phone, questions, cage. She felt it closing, breath by breath, choice by choice, until there was no space left to move without triggering something she couldn't take back. Nadine realized the truth with cold, absolute clarity. Junho didn't want her safe. He wanted her contained, controlled, manageable, an object he could position and reposition as needed. The difference between those two things, safety and containment, was the difference between a person and a possession. And Nadine had stopped being a person to him the moment Elias said her name. 24 hours left. She touched the window glass, cold against her palm, and made a decision that would either free her or destroy everything she'd spent years building. Not the marriage, not the safety, the disguise, the careful, patient invisibility that had kept her alive. Tomorrow in that warehouse, one of two things would happen. Junho would see her as she really was and respect it, or he'd see her and try to break her for hiding it. Either way, the performance was ending. 24 hours left, and I made a decision that would either free me or destroy everything. Then it happened. The moment Junho's entire illusion shattered, and he didn't even realize what he'd just seen. It happened in a back corridor where no one was supposed to see. Nadine was moving from the kitchen to the stairs, a path she'd walked 1,000 times, when one of Junho's guards intercepted her. Not the quiet one who usually watched the door, a newer hire, younger, eager to prove something. "Boss wants you in the office," he said, reaching for her arm without asking. His grip landed too hard, fingers digging into her bicep like she was cargo that needed hauling. The kind of touch that said, "You're not a person right now, you're an object I've been told to move." Nadine's body reacted before her mind could stop it. Wrist turned, a pivot so small it looked like nothing, just a shift of weight, a rotation of the forearm, but it stole his balance completely. The guard's momentum betrayed him. His center of gravity tilted. Nadine didn't pull him, didn't strike him. She just redirected the force he'd already committed to, and suddenly he was against the wall, breath trapped, arm locked in a position that made movement impossible without breaking something. Controlled, efficient, terrifying in its quietness. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Nadine held him there, not out of rage, not out of fear, just muscle memory executing a sequence her body had practiced 10,000 times in another life. Then she saw Junho standing at the end of the hallway. Watching, she released the guard instantly. Step back, face calm, breathing steady, as if nothing had happened. As if her hands hadn't just demonstrated competence that wasn't supposed to exist in a woman who folded laundry and smiled at dinner parties. The guard slid down the wall slightly, gasping, one hand clutching his shoulder. He stared at Nadine like she'd transformed into something his brain couldn't process. Like she was a ghost wearing his boss's wife's face. Most people don't know this, but the quietest person in a violent room is usually the one who's already decided how it ends. What happened next proved it. Junho walked toward them slowly. Too slowly. Each step deliberate, measured, like he was approaching a wild animal he wasn't sure he could control. His face cycled through emotions faster than Nadine had ever seen. Confusion first. What just happened? Then recognition as his brain pieced together what his eyes had witnessed. Not luck, not accident, technique, training, discipline. Then came realization, the kind that hits like cold water. His weak wife was only weak because she chose to be. And finally, something ugly. Not admiration, not respect. Wounded pride. The specific rage of a man realizing the control he thought he had was always an illusion, and everyone might have known except him. What was that? Junho's voice came out quiet. Dangerous quiet. Nadine didn't answer immediately. She was too busy cataloging her own reaction, relief mixed with dread, tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them. Relief because the performance was exhausting, because holding that mask in place for years had cost more than anyone would understand. Dread because now the mask was off, and she couldn't put it back on. "He grabbed me too hard," Nadine said finally, voice even. "I reacted." Reacted. Junho repeated the word like he was tasting poison. "Where did you learn to react like that?" The guard was still on the floor, breath shallow, eyes locked on Nadine with the kind of fear that comes from watching your reality rewrite itself in 4 seconds. "Jamaica," Nadine said. Simple, true, incomplete. She watched Junho's face change again, not softening, hardening, because if she'd been capable of this the entire time, then every moment he'd treated her like property, every command he'd given her like she was a child, every public correction and private cruelty, all of it had been inflicted on someone who could have ended him. His control had always been a joke, and now he knew it. 2 of Junho's other men appeared at the end of the corridor, drawn by the commotion. They looked at the guard on the floor, at Nadine standing calm and still, at Junho's face, and their expressions shifted from confusion to something more dangerous. Recalculation. Because the hierarchy they'd understood had just been exposed as fiction. Junho stepped closer to Nadine, voice dropping to something only she could hear. "You've been lying to me." "I've been surviving you," Nadine corrected. His hand twitched, instinct reaching for violence, but stopped. Because now he didn't know what would happen if he touched her wrong. The uncertainty was new, humiliating. If you're not subscribed yet, you're about to miss the moment everything explodes. Drop a comment. What would you do in Nadine's place? Nadine turned and walked toward the stairs, not running, not hurrying, just moving with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you're not the one who should be afraid anymore. Behind her, she heard Junho's breathing, fast, shallow, the sound of a man whose entire world had just tilted. Junho finally knew the truth, but knowing didn't make him respect me. It made him dangerous, because a man who feels humiliated doesn't forgive, he retaliates. And retaliation, Nadine understood, was coming. 12 hours later, Junho announced the gathering. He called it loyalty. Nadine called it what it was, a public execution dressed as a meeting, and she was the one he planned to sacrifice. The warehouse back room smelled like motor oil and old concrete, industrial, cold, the kind of space where violence felt expected rather than shocking. Junho's inner circle filled the room, 6 men arranged in a loose semicircle, chairs scraping, phones silenced. All attention focused forward like an audience waiting for a performance they'd been promised. Nadine read the room the way she'd been taught, fast, methodical, survivalist. 2 men armed, one with a shoulder holster visible when he leaned forward, another with a bulge at his ankle. 3 eager, sitting forward, hungry for entertainment. One already checked out, eyes distant, like he'd seen this show before and knew how it ended. The youngest captain kept glancing at the door. Escape math, same as hers. Junho stood at the center, king of a shrinking kingdom, trying to reclaim space through sheer performance. This gathering wasn't about Elias's ultimatum anymore. It was about Nadine, about proving he still controlled the one thing that had embarrassed him in front of witnesses. Sit, he told her. Not a request. Nadine sat. The provocation started small, a comment about her posture, a correction about where she placed her hands. Little humiliations designed to make her shrink while his men watched and learned that power here still ran one direction. Nadine stayed calm, quiet, let him perform. But Junho needed more. Needed her to break visibly so the room could see it, so the story could be rewritten. Wife gets out of line, husband restores order, loyalty confirmed. You've been lying to me, he said, voice rising now, playing to the audience, hiding things, making me look weak. The room leaned in. I haven't, Nadine said, even true. Then Junho's hand snapped across her face. The crack echoed, sharp, public, final. The room held its breath. Nadine turned her head back slowly, touched her cheek once, and stopped acting. The youngest captain moved first, trying to impress, trying to prove loyalty, rushing toward Nadine like she was cargo that needed restraining. His hand reached for her arm. Nadine pivoted, clean sweep. His legs went out, momentum stolen, body hit concrete hard enough to knock the wind out. First boy down. 2 more rushed in. Instinct, pack mentality, the kind of thoughtless violence that fills silence. Nadine moved through them with controlled precision. Wrist turn, lock, floor. Second one tried to grab from behind, elbow back, short strike to solar plexus, balance stolen, joint lock that ended with him gasping against the support beam. No wasted motion. No showboating, just efficiency that made confidence rot into fear. Junho barked orders, louder now, harsher, because he could feel his authority slipping with every second his men stayed on the ground. Get her! 3 more moved, not because they wanted to, because they were terrified of what not moving would mean. Nadine beat them anyway. One came fast, tackle attempt, leg reap, down. One pulled a blade, stupid, panicked. Nadine closed distance, stripped the weapon, sent it sliding across concrete like trash. Gone. One froze halfway to standing, watching her move, and made the smartest decision of the night, stayed down. I felt the cost with every strike. Once you show what you are, you can never be invisible again. But I also felt something else. Freedom. Real freedom. Not borrowed from a man's shadow. The circle widened. The men who remained standing didn't rush anymore. They hesitated, recalculated. Because Nadine had just rewritten the rules of the room, and Junho's proof of dominance was now proof of his weakness. Bodies on concrete. Nadine's breath, steady, controlled, not winded. The sound of grown men gasping for air. The room's collective held breath. Now Junho had to step forward himself. Had to. Because if he didn't, he was already dead as a boss, even if he kept breathing. He swung with rage. Big, humiliating, meant to overwhelm the way rage always worked for him. Nadine blocked. Clean. Redirected his force. For a moment, Junho's face showed pure confusion. Like his brain couldn't process why strength wasn't working, why size didn't matter, why the rules he'd always relied on had suddenly stopped applying. He charged again. Desperation dressed as dominance. Nadine let him come, used his weight against him. A controlled takedown that wasn't brutal, just inevitable, slammed him to the ground. Breath knocked out, dignity leaking faster than air. Junho tried to rise. Nadine stopped him with a final sequence that didn't just hurt him, it taught him. She locked his arm, controlled his movement, held him in a position where every instinct to struggle only made the pain sharper. She made him feel the helplessness he'd tried to sell her for years. Then she released him. On her terms. Nadine leaned in close enough that only Junho could hear, voice calm, breath steady, words chosen with surgical precision. You wanted a weak wife, so you married a woman who mastered weakness as a disguise. She stood, stepped back, let him lie there. The room went silent, not the kind of silence that waits for orders, the kind that rewrites loyalty in real time. The men saw it clearly now. Junho couldn't control his own home. The boys he used as extensions of his ego couldn't stop her. The slap that was supposed to restore face had destroyed it completely. Nadine looked around the room, at the men on the floor, at the ones still standing, at the ones whose eyes had already made the calculation that Junho was finished. She felt the cost settling into her bones. No more invisibility, no more underestimation, no more safety in being dismissed. But she also felt something she hadn't felt in years. The freedom of standing in a room as exactly who she was, with no mask, no performance, no apology. Junho pushed himself up on one elbow, breathing hard, face cycling through emotions too fast to name. Humiliation, rage, fear. The specific terror of a man realizing his entire identity was built on a lie. Nadine didn't help him, didn't gloat, just stood there, steady and calm, while the room absorbed the truth it had just witnessed. But I wasn't finished. Because beating him physically? That was mercy. What came next was justice. Nadine reached into her jacket, slow, deliberate, giving no one a reason to panic, and pulled out a slim folder she'd prepared that morning. The men still standing shifted their weight. The ones on the floor stayed down. Junho pushed himself to sitting, breath ragged, watching her with eyes that had finally started asking the right questions too late. She opened the folder, let the silence build, then spoke with the calm precision of someone reading a court ruling. The properties on Walnut Street, the 3 fronts in Old City, the accounts at First Liberty and Commonwealth Trust, the distribution warehouse near the port. Nadine's voice carried through the room without effort. All registered under Nadine Sinclair Kwan, sole owner, legal, binding, signed over the last 3 years for protection. She looked at Junho. I own the clean foundation of everything you built. No gloating, no theatrics, just fact. Junho's face drained. Not from pain, from understanding. The documents he'd had her sign, the signatures he'd guided with cologne-scented reassurances and promises of safety, had quietly transferred legal ownership of every legitimate asset to the wife he'd just slapped in front of his crew. The empire had a shell with his name on it. But the foundation? The part that kept investigators from knocking? That was hers. One of the captains, the one who always sat closest to power, started to stand, mouth opening like he wanted to object, to offer some solution that would restore order. Nadine turned to face him. Then she delivered the second blow. Sit down, Raymond. The same Raymond who's been skimming 12% off the Northside collections for 8 months. Raymond froze. Nadine's gaze swept the room methodically, landing on each face with quiet certainty. Derek's been talking to the crew from South Philly about potential partnership terms. Conversations Junho doesn't know about. Luis has a gambling debt that's 3 weeks from becoming everyone's problem. And Carter? She paused. Carter's already sent his resume to 2 different operations because he knows this one's sinking. The room went colder. No emotion, no accusations, just precision. Name, crime, consequence. The men realized what they should have understood years ago. The silent wife had been listening, watching, recording. While they dismissed her as furniture, she'd been building a ledger of every betrayal, every lie, every moment of disloyalty they thought was invisible. Their loyalty didn't transfer to Nadine, it evaporated from Junho. Because in a world where power was perception, Junho had just been exposed as the only person in the room who didn't know what was happening in his own organization. Some say she went too far, others say it was poetic justice. Comment below, guilty or not guilty? Nadine pulled a single document from the folder. Separation terms, already drafted, already notarized, just waiting for one signature. She placed it on the concrete floor in front of Junho. You have one option, she said. Sign. Walk away with whatever dignity is left. Keep the dirty money, the reputation, the ghost of what you built. Or refuse and watch me dismantle every legitimate piece until there's nothing left but the parts that put you in prison. Junho stared at the paper, then at Nadine, then at his men, looking for loyalty, for support, for someone to tell him this wasn't happening. No one spoke, because the room had just watched him lose a fight he started, then lose an empire he thought he controlled, then lose the respect he'd spent years building, all in the span of 10 minutes. The slap wasn't strength, it was panic. And panic, weaponized against the wrong person, was suicide. Full circle. Poetic, surgical. Junho had planned to humiliate Nadine publicly to restore control. Instead, she humiliated him publicly using his own standards. Respect, power, face. And she did it without rage, without violence beyond self-defense. Just precision. If you think this ending was satisfying, wait until you see what she does next. Only subscribers get the full story. Don't be left behind. Junho picked up the pen with shaking hands and signed. Nadine folded the document, placed it back in the folder, and walked toward the exit. I left that warehouse with paperwork, keys, and one thing Junho never gave me, my name back. But walking out wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. The Philadelphia night air hit Nadine's face like cold water, sharp, clarifying, real. She walked away from the warehouse without looking back, folder tucked under her arm, keys in her pocket, breath visible in the December cold. Free. Alone. Whole. The city skyline stretched before her, buildings lit against the dark, I-95 humming in the distance, with traffic that moved without asking permission. She'd lived here for years, but tonight Philadelphia felt different. Not because the city had changed, because she had stopped pretending to be smaller than she was. Nadine didn't go back to the house she'd shared with Junho. That place had stopped being home the moment locks became cages. Instead, she returned to the small apartment she'd quietly rented 3 months ago, the contingency plan she'd built when survival stopped feeling like enough. The space was modest. 1 bedroom, clean lines, windows that faced east where morning light would come without asking. Most importantly, locks she'd chosen, silence she controlled, a door that opened only when she decided. She moved through the apartment methodically, muscle memory guiding her hands while her mind processed what had just happened. The cost settled into her bones, not regret, just awareness. She could never be underestimated again, never hide the same way, never rely on invisibility as armor. But freedom without performance was worth it. Nadine opened the closet and reached behind folded winter clothes to retrieve the one item she'd kept hidden since before Pennsylvania. A silk sash, deep red, edges worn soft from years of use, fabric that held memory in every thread. The symbol of her highest training level. The proof that the woman she'd been in Jamaica wasn't erased, just buried. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight. Not heavy, just significant. We've all worn masks to survive. But there comes a moment when survival isn't enough. You need to live as yourself, no matter the cost. If you felt that, you're not alone. The sash represented discipline earned through repetition. Hours of practice until movements became reflex. Mental conditioning that taught her patience wasn't weakness. It was strategy. The understanding that real power didn't announce itself. It simply was. Nadine moved to the window and looked out at Philadelphia. The city had given her anonymity when she needed to disappear. Now it would witness her return to herself, not as Junho's wife, not as the quiet woman who smiled at the right times, but as Nadine. Just Nadine. Disciplined. Trained. She wasn't running away. She was returning to an identity she'd packed away for survival, unpacking it now that survival had transformed into something more. Agency. Choice. The right to exist without performing softness for men who confuse control with love. The slap didn't break her. It ended the disguise. Nadine folded the sash carefully and placed it on the dresser where she could see it every morning. A reminder that strength doesn't always look like violence, and that choosing restraint is different from having no choice at all. She thought about Junho, still in that warehouse, surrounded by men who just watched his world collapse. She didn't hate him, didn't love him anymore either, just understood him finally. A man so afraid of being weak that he made everyone around him smaller to feel large. People ask if I regret it. Regret what? Showing the truth or staying hidden so long? I don't regret either. I survived the way I needed to. And when survival became a cage, I broke it the only way a room full of predators would understand. The quiet of her apartment felt different from the silence of Junho's house. Not empty, not oppressive, just hers. Nadine stood at the window as Philadelphia settled into night, one hand resting on the sash.